Under Stalin's rule, no one was untouchable, not even his own blood. His eldest son, Yakov Zhugashvili, grew up surrounded by power, but starved of love. His life was shaped by a father who demanded loyalty but gave nothing in return. What unfolded was a quiet tragedy behind the walls of the Kremlin and the barbed wire of a Nazi camp. Yakov Zhugashvili was born on March 18, 1907, in the quiet village of Bazhi, tucked in the hills of western Georgia, which was then part of the Russian Empire. His birth came during a time of political unrest and growing revolutionary activity. His mother, Kato Svanidze, was just 22 years old at the time. She came from a humble background and had married Joseph Zhugashvili, later known to the world as Joseph Stalin, a few years earlier. Kato was known for her loyalty to her husband's political cause, but she had no idea that her life would end so soon. In December of that same year, when Yakov was still an infant, Kato died suddenly from typhus. Her death devastated the Svanidze family, but Stalin barely reacted. He had already begun to turn away from any emotional attachment. Kato's funeral was one of the last times Stalin would have direct involvement with his son for years to come. At the time of Yakov's birth, Stalin was deeply involved in illegal Marxist organizing against the Tsarist regime. He was constantly changing locations, using fake names, attending secret meetings, and publishing underground pamphlets. The life of a revolutionary left no space for fatherhood, and after Kato's death, Stalin completely removed himself from Yakov's upbringing. He handed the baby over to the Svanidze family, who lived in Tbilisi, and focused entirely on his political work. Yakov's early years were spent in quiet poverty, passed between the homes of uncles and aunts. Though they cared for him, resources were limited, and the emotional absence of both parents left a deep void. He didn't go to elite schools or receive any special attention. He lived like many other children of the time, struggling, unsure of the future, and completely unaware that his father was becoming a central figure in a political movement that would change the country forever. By the time Yakov was a teenager, his father had already been arrested several times by Tsarist authorities, imprisoned, and exiled to Siberia. He managed to escape more than once and continued building his name within the Bolshevik Party. During all of this, Stalin never returned to Georgia to see his son, never sent for him, and never wrote letters. Even after the 1917 revolution, when Lenin and the Bolsheviks took control of Russia and Stalin rose quickly within the new Soviet leadership, Yakov remained where he had always been, far away, unknown, and untouched by his father's growing power. In the years following the revolution, as Moscow became the political center of the new Soviet state, Stalin took his place at the top. Yet Yakov continued to live in Georgia, completely disconnected from the life and influence his father now held. When he finally arrived in Moscow in the early 1920s, he was a teenager, stepping into a world completely different from the quiet life he had known in Georgia. For over a decade, he had lived far from the political noise of the capital, unaware of the full extent of his father's rise to power. Now, at just 14 years old, he was placed directly inside the Kremlin, where decisions that shaped the entire Soviet Union were being made daily. It wasn't a home. It was a fortress of power, tension, and absolute control. Stalin, now a prominent Bolshevik figure, showed little interest in reconnecting with his son. There was no warmth in their reunion, no sign of a father trying to make up for lost time. Instead, Yakov was treated like an inconvenience. He had no political use and lacked the tough, ambitious personality that Stalin admired in others. To his father, Yakov was soft, distant, and intellectually unimpressive. At the same time, Stalin's new wife, Nadezhda Alliluyeva, was trying to manage a household that was already burdened with political stress. She was only in her 20s, raising two young children, Vasily and Svetlana, while supporting a man who was already becoming known for his cruelty. Nadezhda tried to bring Yakov into the family, to create some form of stability for him, but her efforts couldn't override Stalin's complete lack of interest. Inside that household, Yakov quickly realized he was an outsider. He was neither part of Stalin's new family, nor accepted as his son in any emotional sense. Stalin regularly insulted him in front of others, often calling him useless or weak. These weren't occasional remarks, they were constant and public. The atmosphere in the home was built on fear and hierarchy, and Yakov was always at the bottom. Yakov himself was quiet and sensitive. He liked reading, spent time alone, and didn't try to fight for attention. But in Stalin's world, silence was weakness, and emotions were a liability. Yakov was never praised for anything, never included in discussions, and never encouraged to find his own path. Every day was another reminder that he didn't belong. Even among his younger half-siblings, Yakov didn't find comfort. Vasily was energetic and spoiled, while Svetlana, still a child, was closer to her mother. Yakov lived in the same house as his family, but felt like a stranger. The emotional distance between him and Stalin kept growing. There was no trust or affection. The damage done in childhood was now permanent, and the small chance of reconciliation had already vanished. By 1928, Yakov was no longer a boy. He was 21 and desperate to escape the oppressive life he had been forced into. Years of silence, rejection, and humiliation had left deep scars. He knew he would never be what his father wanted, so he tried to build a different future for himself. That hope came through a relationship with Zoya Gunina, a kind and educated Jewish woman living in Moscow. Zoya was different from everyone in Stalin's circle. She wasn't involved in politics. She came from a cultured background and gave Yakov something he had never experienced: emotional support. For the first time, he felt valued, not for his name or status, but for who he was. Being with her gave him a sense of peace, something he had never felt in the Kremlin. He wanted to marry her, start fresh, and finally build a life outside his father's shadow. But Stalin refused to allow it. He didn't care about Yakov's feelings, and he didn't respect the relationship. Although the Soviet Union claimed to fight against anti-Semitism, Stalin's personal views were different. He saw Zoya's Jewish background as a political problem. He believed the marriage would harm his image and refused to accept it. He didn't ask questions or show any concern. He simply gave an order to end the relationship. Yakov was devastated. For someone who had already grown up in isolation, this rejection hit even harder. He had found a rare moment of happiness, and it was crushed in an instant. His relationship was mocked. Zoya's family was humiliated, and Yakov was once again treated like a child who had no control over his own life. In despair, Yakov locked himself in a room with a pistol and shot himself in the chest. It was not a cry for attention. It was the act of someone who had finally broken. He survived the wound, but recovery was long and painful, physically and emotionally. While lying in bed, recovering from the near-fatal injury, he received no sympathy from Stalin. No visit, no message, nothing. What he did receive was mockery. Stalin reportedly laughed at the failed attempt, joking that his son couldn't even kill himself properly. From that point on, any chance of earning his father's respect was gone. But despite his father's cold treatment, Yakov still felt a strong desire to contribute to the Soviet Union. In the early 1930s, he joined the Red Army. It was a decision that gave him structure and purpose, something he hadn't found in his personal life. He focused on his training, studied military science, and graduated as a junior officer. He earned the rank of lieutenant and was assigned to artillery units, rotating through different postings across the Soviet Union. He followed orders, took part in drills, and handled equipment like any other soldier. But his last name always followed him. In some units, officers gave him special treatment, unsure how to behave around the son of Stalin. In others, fellow soldiers looked at him with suspicion or jealousy, assuming he hadn't earned his position through merit. Still, Yakov didn't use his father's influence. He avoided attention and tried to keep his personal life quiet. He followed protocol and worked within the strict military system, hoping his performance would speak for itself. As the decade moved on and political tensions grew in Europe, with Hitler rising in Germany and war becoming more likely, Yakov remained in the background, committed to his role. While his father rose to absolute power, Yakov stayed focused on being a competent officer. As Operation Barbarossa tore across Soviet borders on June 22, 1941, the German assault moved with terrifying speed. Hitler's forces, numbering over 3 million troops, stormed into Soviet territory in a coordinated attack, stretching from the Baltic Sea to the Black Sea. The Wehrmacht's blitzkrieg tactics, fast, focused, and brutal, left Soviet forces paralyzed. Within days, entire Red Army divisions were surrounded, airfields destroyed, and key supply lines cut off. The Luftwaffe controlled the skies, bombing communication centers, railways, and troop movements with deadly precision. Stalin's refusal to act on months of intelligence warnings had left the Soviet military exposed. No proper defensive strategy had been prepared. Command structures crumbled, orders went unanswered, and panic spread through the ranks. In this chaos, Yakov was serving near the Belarusian city of Vitebsk. As an artillery officer, he was responsible for coordinating firepower against the German advance. His battalion was positioned along the Western Front, which quickly became one of the most unstable sectors. Within days of the invasion, German air raids began pounding Soviet artillery positions. Yakov's unit suffered heavy damage from Luftwaffe bombing runs before German tanks and mechanized infantry broke through nearby Soviet lines. Cut off from reinforcements, communications down, and supplies running low, the unit struggled to hold its ground. By early July, German troops had pushed deep into Soviet territory, reaching Smolensk and preparing to encircle large portions of the Red Army. Yakov's unit, caught in this encirclement, had no clear escape route. The front was collapsing around them. Some soldiers tried to retreat on foot through dense forests. Others were captured in large groups as the Germans sealed off the pocket. On July 16, 1941, Yakov was taken prisoner near Smolensk. The exact details of his capture remain uncertain. Some accounts suggest his artillery position had exhausted its shells and was no longer operational. Others hint that Yakov may have been wounded during the bombardments and unable to continue resisting. Regardless of how it happened, his capture immediately attracted attention. After confirming his identity, the German military immediately recognized the value of their prisoner. He was not just another Soviet officer. Capturing him gave the Nazis a rare chance to strike a psychological blow against the Soviet leadership. Yakov was first held in a regular prisoner of war camp near Hammelburg in Bavaria, where German intelligence officers interrogated him. They pressured him to make public statements against the Soviet Union and encouraged him to cooperate, but Yakov refused. He wouldn't denounce his country or speak out against Soviet policies, even after being told he could receive better treatment. His refusal frustrated his captors, but it made him even more important in their eyes. Soon after, Yakov was transferred to the Sachsenhausen concentration camp, located just outside Berlin. Unlike other camps meant for forced labor or mass killings, Sachsenhausen held high-profile prisoners, political figures, foreign dignitaries, and military officers of importance. Yakov was placed in a special section where the most valuable captives were isolated under heavy security. He was kept in strict confinement, with very little contact with the outside world and constant surveillance. The Nazis photographed him in captivity, carefully staging images that showed him in uniform, looking defeated. These photographs were used in leaflets and newspapers as part of a propaganda campaign. German officials claimed that if even Stalin's own son had surrendered, the rest of the Red Army should give up as well. They distributed these materials near Soviet front lines, hoping to lower morale and convince troops to stop fighting. Though the strategy failed to produce the widespread panic the Nazis hoped for, Yakov's capture remained a major talking point. When Stalin was informed that his son had been taken prisoner by the Germans, his reaction was startling. He showed no concern, no sadness, no sign of a father worried about his child's fate. Instead, he responded with detachment. To Stalin, surrender under any condition was an unforgivable crime. He had already signed Order No. 270 in August 1941, which declared that any Soviet soldier who allowed themselves to be captured was a traitor. Families of prisoners of war were often punished, and returning soldiers were treated with deep suspicion. That same rule applied to his own blood. Rather than looking into the circumstances of Yakov's capture, Stalin immediately judged him as weak. He didn't consider that his son might have been injured, surrounded, or left without any options. All that mattered was that Yakov had not died fighting. For Stalin, that alone meant disgrace. In early 1943, after nearly 2 years in captivity, Yakov's name reappeared in German diplomatic channels. Hitler's forces had captured thousands of Soviet troops, but they were also losing some of their own. One of the highest-profile German prisoners in Soviet hands was Field Marshal Friedrich Paulus, the commander of the Sixth Army at Stalingrad. After his historic surrender in February 1943, Paulus was being held in Soviet custody and was a valuable bargaining chip. The Germans saw an opportunity. They offered Stalin a prisoner exchange, Yakov for Paulus. On paper, it seemed fair, one general for another, one high-ranking officer for one of similar status. But Stalin rejected the proposal outright. He reportedly told officials, "I will not trade a marshal for a lieutenant." To him, the rank difference alone made the offer insulting. But more than that, Stalin had already erased Yakov from his personal life. He was no longer a son, merely a failed soldier who had disgraced the family name. After the rejection, Yakov's time in captivity grew darker. Isolated and under constant surveillance, he became more withdrawn. Witnesses later claimed that he was deeply depressed, feeling abandoned by his country and his father. On April 14, 1943, something happened that has remained a mystery for decades. Yakov ran toward the electrified barbed wire fence surrounding the Sachsenhausen camp. Guards shouted at him to stop, but he didn't. As he reached the fence, he either touched it or was shot. Reports vary. What's known for certain is that he died instantly. Some accounts claim it was suicide, an act of defiance after learning his father had rejected him. Others suggest it may have been a calculated move to provoke the guards into killing him, essentially forcing a death sentence. A few theories even argue that he was murdered by his captors to avoid further complications. But without clear evidence, the exact circumstances of his death remain unresolved. Back in the Soviet Union, news of Yakov's death reached Stalin slowly. His reaction, once again, was chilling. He made no public documents, photographs, and personal accounts slowly revealed the hidden life of the son who could never meet his father's expectations. In the years since, historians have debated whether Yakov was a victim of war or a casualty of Stalin's obsession with strength and